So we can move to the next talk, which is very, very interesting one as well. Dr. George Box, famous statistician, he had said that all models are wrong and only some are useful. To build useful scientific models of the real world, we need tools, and complexity science offers a framework to make such tools. The next talk by Sitabhra Sinha, Dr. Sitabhra Sinha, is to focus on this topic. It's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Sitabhra Sinha, who is a professor of theoretical physics and computational biology at the Institute of Mathematical Sciences at Chennai. He received his Ph.D. from Indian Statistical Institute, Kolkata, for the research on nonlinear dynamics of excitatory and inhibitory neural network models in 1998. Following postdoctoral positions at the Indian Institute of Science at Bangalore and the Weill Medical College at Cornell University, he joined the faculty of IMSc in 2002. His research areas is complex systems and data science with interest in networks, nonlinear dynamics, biological pattern formation, modeling physiological systems, and applying statistical physics to understand social and economic phenomena. He has previously been adjunct faculty member of the National Institute of Advanced Studies in Bangalore and the Department of Computer Science and Engineering at IIT Kharagpur. So, the title of his talk is Network, Nonlinear and Far from Equilibrium, Complexity Science as a Framework for Modeling the Real World. Welcome, Dr. Sinha.
Thank you, Michelle. So it's a pleasure to be here, and it's always a wonderful experience to go out of your comfort zone and talk to an audience who are not the usual people that you give talks to during conferences. So what I've done is I have decided to take this opportunity not to talk about specific models or results that we work on, but rather to give you, some kind of a glimpse about the philosophical framework that we use to think about problems. So what is the framework that we use to think about complexity, to think about specific models, or to think about specific phenomena that we're trying to approach, be it in the social sciences, biological sciences, or in physics, right? All right, so what we would start with is, of course, very fundamental. We'd first ask the question, what is complex? Because something that I figured out after entering this area is that different people mean completely different things by the word complex. Okay, so, for example, my 6-year-old son thinks adding 2 3-digit numbers is quite complex, right? But I think that's not quite what we would mean by complex. So let's start by thinking about what's complex. And the moment we start thinking about this, we realize it's actually quite a hard question to answer, right? Because it depends upon your context. It depends upon which background you're coming from, and so on. So let's just invert the problem. So let's start by asking what isn't complex. Okay? Now, there's this famous joke about MIT graduate student and his prayer, and we will use that to essentially define what isn't complex. So it's said that every night before going to bed, the students ask God to please make the world linear, stationary, and Gaussian. All right, so we will take that as our starting point. Sorry about, I think some font changes happened while transferring this. So what isn't complex are systems which are specified with these properties. They are linear. What do we mean by linear? So linear means that effectively, if you have solution A and if you have solution B, then any linear combination of those solutions is also a solution. Okay? So which makes analyzing simple systems a breeze, because you can try to figure out how this part works, how that part works, and you say that, okay, the way the whole system works, you just sum together. So the whole is literally a sum of its parts, right? It's stationary, so essentially it means the properties of the system don't change over time. It's Gaussian, and what that means effectively is that the different causative factors are independent of each other. So they don't really affect each other in any way, they are completely independent, and they're additive. So which means that we can apply the central limit theorem, which makes the distribution Gaussian. And finally, they're typically at equilibrium. Now, equilibrium, of course, means different things to different kinds of sciences. What we mean by equilibrium essentially means that there are no external forces which are essentially driving the system. So we can ignore all external factors, we can essentially take it to be isolated. And as a very famous physicist, Don Farmer, once said, equilibrium is boring because equilibrium means death. Any living process is necessarily out of equilibrium. So essentially when we are dealing with simple systems, not surprisingly, they are mostly very boring. And so we will define complex as a negation of all these things and say that a complex system is essentially characterized by any or every one of these characteristics. They are typically nonlinear, so you cannot take two solutions, add them together and expect the sum to be also a solution. So typically the whole is more than the sum of its parts. They are non-stationary, the properties can change over time. They are non-Gaussian, the causative factors are not independent of each other, they often can actually influence each other. And finally, they are far from equilibrium, so typically you have external environment directly driving such processes. Right? And as I often tell my introductory class, Amitabh Bachchan actually had a wonderful way of expressing this whole idea of nonlinearity when he said, "Ye wo hai jo do aur do panch bana de." So essentially, that's nonlinearity. Right? That 2 and 2 oftentimes is very different from 4. Okay? So this brings us to the concept of emergence, that what you see in the component parts will give you no preparation of understanding what you see in the whole. Now, that's, I believe, is the hallmark of all complex systems. The fact that even if you completely understand the components, when you put them together to create the whole system, the system behaves in ways that are entirely unexpected. Okay? And an example is the brain. The brain is made out of a large number of neurons. Now, of course, the neuroscientists would say that a neuron is an extremely complicated object. I have no quarrels with that. However, I think all of you would agree, and most neuroscientists would agree, that the brain's complexity is at a whole different level compared to that of a single neuron. A neuron, for example, will not stand here and give this talk to you. Right? So what is it that allows putting together about 10 to the power 11 neurons and then get an object which would try to understand itself, which is what a human brain often tries to do. And so this fact lies at the very central core of complex systems, trying to understand how the behavior that we see at the level of the system emerges as a result of interaction between these components. Now, yesterday with dinner we were talking about this emergence and several of you mentioned Adam Smith, several of you mentioned other people who have essentially talked about emergence. So for example, Adam Smith very famously invoked the metaphor of the invisible hand when trying to talk about the economy. So he was saying that individual members of the economy are rarely working towards the betterment of society. They are just looking out for themselves. And yet, each of these individuals working for their own selfish benefit nevertheless end up creating an organic entity which essentially develops over time, resulting in everybody enriching themselves. Right? Actually, I think Johann Wolfgang von Goethe placed it even better. So in Faust, he has this quote which beautifully brings forth the holistic approach towards understanding something. So he said, "Who traces life and seeks to give descriptions of the things that live, begins with killing to dissect, he gets the pieces to inspect." So that's a wonderful evocative way of describing the reductionist way of understanding complex systems, which is, you just destroy it, take apart all the pieces, and then you look at each of these component parts to excruciating detail and try to describe their working. But the problem with that is the lifeless limbs beneath his knife, all parts, but the link which gave them life. And that is essentially what complex systems is all about. To understand this interaction, the link which gave them life, how is it actually able to result in the whole having very different properties from the components. Now, of course, the problem with Goethe is when you have such literary descriptions of emergence, you really can't use it to do any quantitative science with it. And so, to my mind, a much more useful description of emergence is actually given by the physicist Phil Anderson in his famous article in Science in '72, which is simply called "More is Different." And what he says in that article is the following. So he says that, look, if you look at the different sciences, you can always find a pair of signs where the elementary entities of science X essentially obeys the laws of science Y. So for example, if you look at solid-state physics, it describes the behavior of electrons in a crystal lattice. Now each of those individual elements, electrons and the protons which make up this crystal lattice, are of course obeying the laws of elementary particle physics. Similarly, if you look at chemistry, you are dealing with molecules interacting with each other, but each of the molecules are of course obeying the laws of many-body physics. Further up the ladder, molecular biologists are working with molecules which are of course obeying the laws of chemistry. Cell biologists are dealing with cells, which are of course made out of a large number of molecules like DNA and so on, which of course are essentially the subject of study of molecular biology. And you go further up the ladder and you figure out that psychology is dealing with individuals, each of whose component parts like the brain and so on can be described by the laws of physiology. And finally, social sciences, where you're talking about how crowds work together, is made out of individuals who are themselves the subject of study of psychology. However, it does not immediately imply that X is just applied Y. Okay? So chemistry is not applied physics, and neither is biology just applied chemistry. Why? That's because whenever you enter the domain of a new science, entirely new principles and laws emerge, which you cannot derive for the first principles of science Y. No matter how good a chemist you are, you'll be very hard pressed to, for example, from scratch derive something like the central dogma of molecular biology, that DNA gives rise to RNA, which in turn gives rise to proteins. Although each of these molecules are essentially, of course, obeying the laws of chemistry. And this is brought beautifully, in my mind, by a very simple computer game, the game of life, which was proposed by John Houghton Conway back in 1970s as a setting where you can define all the rules of interaction between the individual entities and yet have a system whose properties are entirely unpredictable from scratch. And why is this of interest? Because oftentimes you would have a particularly cocky string theorist coming up and saying, look fellows, all we need is to derive this theory of everything, and after that science will be dead because we'll know everything. Which is complete nonsense, of course, because here is a system where you have the theory of everything. You know the exact rules by which different cells are alive or dead at specific times. And yet, when you make these cells interact, they actually can give rise to things like gliders, which collide with each other, construct glider guns by self-organization, and these glider guns keep spewing gliders, which essentially spread throughout the system. It's not surprising, in a sense, that Conway called it life, because it has all the complexities that we associate with living processes. And moreover, people have, in fact, analyzed life and shown that it's capable of universal computation in the sense of Turing. So anything that any computer is capable of, you can actually construct suitable configurations of the game of life that can do it. And yet, when you look at the theory of everything, you surely wouldn't be able to say that it would be capable of so many things. And to prove that this is indeed so, I can ask you, like, what if you change any of these rules? Do you think you'll still get back all these properties? So you can try to do that. In fact, John Hoffman Conway famously is said to have actually gone through a whole series of possible rules, possible theories of everything, before he hit upon this particular combination of rules, which would actually show all of this complexity. And here is a very simple example where you understand the parts. You know everything about the parts, and yet you cannot say anything about what kind of complexity that it will give rise to. So you will actually have to simulate the whole system in order to figure out what are all the different complicated things that it's capable of. So now that we have, a concrete example of what's a complex system, how can we understand emergence, and so on, you can of course ask the question, why do we need a separate science for complex systems? Each of the scientific domains individually are looking at specific complex systems in their domain. Do we need a general theory of complex systems at all? And if so, what possible form may that science take? I don't have a concrete answer for that, but what I can do is I can give you an example of what such a science might be like and why we need a science like that. And the example I have is why we have statistical mechanics, a specific branch of physics which connects two very old and traditional subfields of physics, namely classical mechanics, which studies the behavior of single particles, and thermodynamics, which studies the behavior of billions and trillions of particles. Now, historically, both of these fields arose independent of each other. Classical mechanics arose from the attempts of Kepler to characterize the laws of motion of celestial bodies, and were eventually codified by Newton in his famous laws of motion. Thermodynamics, on the other hand, arose completely separately with people's attempt at understanding the behavior of gases. So, for example, you had people like Boyle, Charles, Day-Lucas, and so on, who tried to relate the pressure, volume, and temperature of gases through phenomenological relations between them. So, for example, by doing experiments, they would figure out that the product of pressure and volume of a gas is constant under a given temperature. And this, in turn, was codified through the laws of thermodynamics by Carnot, Clausius, and others. And by 19th century, both of these sciences essentially became quite mature. But what was missing was the link between these two. And if you think that that's just, why would we need to link these two sciences? Well, there are very fundamental reasons for doing that. So one of the biggest conundrums which was facing a 19th century scientist was how to make the laws which are governing the behavior of single particles consistent with the behavior of an entire volume of gas. Where such inconsistencies become most glaring are, for example, if you look at the laws of motion of classical bodies, you realize that they are time reversible. So whether you run them forward in time or backward in time, the laws are exactly the same. And yet, when you look at thermodynamics, you find time suddenly has a direction. So for example, suppose I take a jug of water and drop it from here, it will fall to the ground and shatter. Now, the laws of classical mechanics would say that each of these individual particles making up the water, making up the jug, are of course obeying the laws of classical mechanics, so it's just as probable for the shattered jug to come together by itself, all the water molecules which have spilled all over the floor to come then into the jug, and then the jug will leap spontaneously and come to my hand. But I think all of you would agree that if that happens, you'd say that something very spooky has just happened. So why is it that when you have a macroscopic object, you suddenly expect time to flow specifically in one direction, not in the other? So if I take a film of some everyday occurrence, the moment I show it to you backwards, you would immediately know that something is wrong. But if I just show you, a film clip of just a single particle caroming off, some kind of a billiard table, and let's say friction is very low, it'll be very hard to say, whether it's kind of film is being shown forwards or backwards. So how is it that time is completely reversible in the domain of classical mechanics and irreversible the moment you talk about billions of particles? Where is time getting its arrow? So that was the big question facing a 19th century scientist until Ludwig Boltzmann, the famous Austrian physicist, came up and formulated essentially the whole science of statistical mechanics. So he used the concept of entropy to answer the question of where actually time is getting its arrow. The fact that macroscopic systems essentially can be described by a huge number of possible microstates, and that particular state is more probable, which corresponds to the largest number of microstates, which he quantified using the concept of entropy. So systems essentially always tend to move towards that state which has the highest entropy, and this is what gives time its arrow. And so you need a set of principles which would allow you to connect the behavior which is happening at the level of constituent particles to essentially tell you what's happening at the level of the entire system. So the emergent property over here is the arrow of time, and you had to have a complete new science, namely that of statistical mechanics, to explain the emergence of this particular property. So what we are looking for is precisely this. We need a statistical mechanics for complex systems. So you might ask at this point, well, we already have statistical mechanics. Why would we need something entirely new? So that's because the individual entities that we're talking about now are far more complicated than the particles of classical mechanics. We are talking about individuals. We are talking about rational agents who use strategies to figure out how to beat the system. Right? So you can't actually use statistical mechanics, which is very good for dealing with inert, unthinking particles, but would fall apart if you try to apply them to strategizing agents. And so that's why we need a new science of complex systems, and the model of statistical mechanics is probably the best one we have as to what form that new science will take. And so the quest we have essentially is to ask questions like these, that are there universal organizing principles which operate at all kinds of levels for describing all kinds of phenomena. And so these general questions could be, for example, why is it that nature always hits upon networks to design information processing machinery, be it inside the cell or be it in the entire organism. So why is it that nervous systems use networks and so do the intracellular signaling machinery? Both of these entities have the task of taking signals from the external environment and turning into actions. And yet, in principle, nature could have come up with different designs. So for example, it could have just used a set of parallel pathways. It didn't. It used networks. Why? So these are the kinds of questions that such a general science of complex systems is going to answer. And for this, the concept of networks provides a wonderful and efficient framework to think about such systems. So oftentimes you would see that people who do complex systems naturally tend to speak in the language of networks. Networks is of course a tool. It's a way of thinking about complex systems. It's not the only way. But it's extremely versatile. You can use the concept of networks and use it to understand complex systems occurring in economics, occurring in biology, occurring in technology, you can think of internet as a network, you can think of the brain as a network, you can think of entire ecologies as network, and you can think of cells as networks. So that is what gives networks its power. And so what complex system scientists do is that they use networks to understand this emergence. Essentially, how is it that the individual components, when working together, creates behavior entirely different at the level of the entire system. And the aim of network science is to precisely understand how these interactions lead to the complexity that we see at the systems level. So, just to make sure that we are on the same page, let me now define what I mean by a network. So this is of course what mathematicians would call graphs. So a network is described by essentially enumerating all the nodes, which are the elementary entities which making it up, and the interactions or the links which connect these different nodes. Now, you can of course deal with a graphical description like this, but this is very unwieldy when you are trying to do anything mathematically. So oftentimes you'd find that people would interchangeably refer to a network as either a diagram like this or the matrix representation. So where you just have a table of numbers where a particular row and a column tells you whether two entities are connected by a relation or not. So if the ith row and jth column entry of the matrix is 1, that means a link exists between the node labeled I and the node labeled j, and if it's 0, there is no link. Now often you would also find the term complex networks. Now, what's a complex network? To describe what's a complex network, I have to first tell you about what are simple networks or what are non-complex networks, so to say. So, the theoretical understanding of network until about 1998 essentially mostly was centered on these two types of networks. So, one of them was a regular lattice or a grid. So, this is fairly simple. So, you can in fact think of it as a computer network, where every server is, for example, connected to 6 nearest neighbors, or you can think of them as individual processors arranged on some kind of a hexagonal lattice, every processor talking to 6 of their neighboring processors, and what you try to understand are the overall properties of such a system. So physicists would, for example, mostly deal with these kinds of regular networks. On the other hand, mathematicians would work with random networks. So Sanjay already mentioned the Adosh-Renyi network. So these random networks are essentially characterized by just taking a large number of components and then just randomly connecting a fraction of them. So the only quantity which is numerically characterizing such a system is the probability that two randomly chosen pair of elements would be connected with each other. So if you say that this probability is 1, that means everything is connected to everything. It's a globally connected network. If this probability is 0, that means there are no connections. Every node is isolated. But if this probability lies between 0 to 1, let's say half, so that means you look at any pair of nodes, there's a probability half of them is connected. Speaking in a different way, we would say that half of all the possible relations that there could be already exist in the network. Now, when you actually analyze such networks, you suddenly realize that they have very interesting properties nevertheless. So for example, random networks turn out to have extremely low average path length. Now why is that of interest? So it's of interest because of a phenomenon known as 6 degrees of separation, which is also related to the concept of a small world. So let me digress by telling a bit about this 6 degrees of separation. So in the 60s, American psychologist Stanley Milgram did a very interesting experiment. It's actually fair, kind of reminds me of when I was a child, we used to often get these postcards in our mailbox, which would say something like this, that, dear XYZ, Ma Lakshmi has shown herself in my dream and said that, I should write to all my dearest friends about, how luck would shine on me. And so I beseech you that you also write to 10 of your, acquaintances and send this, letter along. If you don't do this, misfortune would, sink you. However, if you do this within a week, you would win a lottery or something like that. Right? And so if you believe in this, you would go around and, write 10 such postcards and you would, just. So essentially the idea is that if this chain continues unbroken, essentially starting from just in one individual, you would have a swarm of such postcards which would essentially envelop the entire country. So what Milgram did was something a bit more selective. So he said, how is it that people are connected to each other through directly known individuals? So for example, he picked a particular person living in Sharon, Massachusetts, which is a suburb of the city of Boston, and he asked certain individuals living in Omaha, Nebraska, which is somewhere in the Midwest. So essentially you have about 4,000 miles separating these two places. And what he asked these people over here was that you have to ensure that this package, which is addressed to this person in Sharon, Massachusetts, must reach him, but you cannot mail this parcel to anyone except a person who's known directly to you. So whenever you post such a parcel, you write down your name and the name of your addressee, and when it reaches the addressee writes down his or her name on this parcel and then puts it to another person who's directly known to the person. And then this goes on until eventually it reaches, hopefully, the target person. So for example, Milgram said, suppose you start with this clerk in Omaha, and she is in this particular state of the United States, and the target is a stockbroker in Sharon, Massachusetts, who's here, and the clerk doesn't know the stockbroker personally, so she cannot directly send this package to him. So she has to pick someone from her circle of acquaintances who she believes could eventually lead to the stockbroker and send the parcel to that person. So for example, in this particular case, she chooses to send it to a self-employed friend in Council Bluffs, Iowa, which is this neighboring state over here. Now, this person also doesn't know this stockbroker personally. So what he does is, he sends it to a publisher who is in the same state but not in the same town. So he sends it to a publisher in Belmont, Massachusetts. So you can see that in just 2 hops, you've already gone from Nebraska to Massachusetts, but you still haven't managed to get to Sharon. But in the next hop, you get to Sharon. So when this publisher happens to know someone in Sharon, so he sends it to a friend who is a tanner in Sharon, Massachusetts. So now you have this package in 3 hops, essentially going from Omaha to the city in which the target individual lives. But you still have to figure out a way of going from this person to this person. Because Sharon is a big neighborhood, so most of the people don't know each other personally. So then you find that this now takes a bit of time. So the tanner, who doesn't know the stockbroker, sends it to a friend who's a sheet metal worker in the same town, who then sends it to a dentist, who then sends it to a printer, who then sends it to a cloth merchant, and eventually this cloth merchant turns out to have personally know the stockbroker, and the package makes it to the stockbroker. Okay? So in 8 hops, you have now gone from this clerk in Omaha to the target, who is the stockbroker in Sharon, Massachusetts. Now, you might ask, what's the likelihood of this? This is a specific chain which actually happened. So when Stanley Milgram actually analyzed all these packages which made its way from the source to the target, he would actually look at what was the length of the chain, he would analyze them, and he found out the average length of the chain was 6. Now, can you have any kind of intuitive way of explaining why is it that there should be 6 degrees of separation between individuals? So if you're a mathematician, you would argue as follows. You would say, all right, let's imagine I know 100 individuals personally. And let's, for argument's sake, say that each of those 100 individuals also know 100 individuals personally. So at second remove, I happen to know 100 times 100, which is 10 to the power 4 individuals.
Friends of friends.
Sorry?
Friends of friends.
Friends of friends, right. And then I can ask, okay, how many friends of friends of friends do I have? Okay. Without breaking a sweat, you would say, well, it's 100 times 100 times 100. Okay, so it's 10 to the power 6. So using this back of the envelope calculation, you would soon realize that at sixth remove, you would know 10 to the power 12 individuals, which is more than the population of the planet. And so therefore, you would argue that it stands to reason why almost any person on this planet would be connected at most 6 orders or 6 degrees of separation from me. So that's the beauty of doing random network calculations. So you can actually work out, just with the back of the envelope calculation, that 6 degrees of separation is not surprising. But there's a big fallacy. Can anyone spot it? There's an enormous fallacy in applying this argument to the actual social network experiment that Milgram did.
Is average.
Well, yeah, but average is fine, right?
Visual, the end target is connected or not connected.
No, that's not it. I mean, so one of the biggest fallacies over here is, yeah, sorry.
I think it's the assumption that you are equally likely to connect to everybody.
Well, not quite. I mean, so the fallacy is this, that I assumed that the 100 individuals I know directly, so when I said that each of them know 100, and so therefore I have 10 to the power 4 friends of friends, that's fallacious, because we know that most of the time the friends of my friends are also my friends. So there's a huge amount of clustering within our social neighborhood. Okay? Friends of friends happen to be also my own friends. And so I actually don't know 10 to the power 4 individuals at second remove. I happen to know a lot less. And yet, when you actually do this social experiment, it turns out that typically you just need very few hops to go from any individual to any other individual. So the question is, how is this possible? How is it that an argument which we use from random network nevertheless appears to work in the domain of real social networks which are far from random? So this was a big mystery till in '98, two people, Duncan Watts and Steve Strogatz, came up with an extremely simple solution of this problem. And if they often say that one of the big hallmarks of extremely fundamental scientific breakthrough is that when you look at it, you kick yourself and start asking, why didn't I think of that, right? And this is one such innovation. You look at this paper and you start wondering, how come other people didn't think of this before them? So the idea they had was very simple. They said that, look, people study random networks, people study regular networks. Is there some way of interpolating between these two? What if we do like this? We take a regular network and we take each of these links, and with a certain probability, we cut it and randomly reconnect it. So if P is 1, that means I've broken and reconnected all the links randomly. Of course, I'll get a random network. And if P is 0, which means I don't reconnect any of the existing links, I will of course get back the regular network. But if P is anything between 0 to 1, I'll get something which is in between a regular network and a random network. Right? Now, not surprising, you would say, okay, so this will have some properties of a regular network and some properties of a random network, big deal. But what they showed was that while regular networks are characterized by extremely high clustering, clustering means, friends of my friends are also my own friends, and large path length, whereas random networks have low clustering and short path length, these kinds of networks, which they term small world networks, tend to have high clustering, exactly like regular networks, and yet short path lengths as short as that of a random network. And they argued that real social networks are essentially like this. They have high clustering, because friends of my friends are also my own friends, but because of a few long-range connections, a few individuals would happen to know someone who's like very far away. Through such well-connected individuals, you would tend to have path lengths which are essentially as short as that of a random network. And they showed this quantitatively by showing how, as you change P, clustering almost doesn't change until at very large values of P, but characteristic path length drops very quickly to almost what you would expect for a random network. And so you have coexistence of the clustering associated with regular networks and characteristic path length associated with a random network, which essentially explains the 6 degrees of separation. And they showed furthermore that small world networks in fact occur in real life. They showed it using a few social networks, technological networks, biological networks, and they also came up with certain implications. So they said that, look, this means that when you are trying to control runaway processes like epidemics, instead of trying to vaccinate each and every individual, which of course would require a huge amount of investment of resources, maybe you should focus on those specific individuals which essentially implement this long-range connections. So for example, in the context of the spread of sexually transmitted diseases like HIV, they said that, look, there are of course different categories of high-risk individuals. There would be intravenous drug users, there would be hemophilia patients, there would be sex workers, but the particular high-risk category which you should focus are the truck drivers, because they would essentially take a localized outbreak of the disease and essentially bring it to a completely different part of the network, very far away, and essentially make what was initially just a local problem into a global problem. So these are the kinds of insights that network science provides. And of course you might ask, okay, it's all very well to have such models for providing proof of principles, and that's what small world network does, but how do we analyze a real world complex system we may be interested in? How do we actually figure out how to actually tackle it? And of course, an example of this is provided by the intracellular signaling network. So this is like the brain of the cell. So the cell essentially uses a set of interacting molecules to look at external environment and then figure out the proper response. And so we have been working for a long time on this. So there are certain immune cells, namely the B cell, which uses a very complicated set of interactions, molecular reaction mechanisms, which couple certain signaling molecules with each other to try to figure out how to respond to particular stimulus. So for example, if you have a breakdown of this communication network, essentially you have disease, because what pathogens do when they invade a host body is to try to confuse this particular system so that the body doesn't know how to respond to it. Okay? So the breakdown of this leads to disease, which is why it's very important to understand how this works. Now, what makes this so complicated is, of course, this is itself part of a very large network. So, given this complexity, how do we even try to comprehend it? So, to some sense, it kind of reminds me of a Rube Goldberg contraption. So, Rube Goldberg was this very famous American cartoonist of the early 20th century. He used to delight in making these designs where you would see that in order to do something very simple, so for example, you just want to design a machine which wipes this person's face after he has soup, he would create an extremely complicated set of operations which depend on each other in very complicated ways. So for example, in this particular case, when a person raises the spoon to his lips, essentially this starts pulling a lever, which in turn pops a toast, which essentially a bird flies up to eat, which in turn causes eventually a rocket to go up, which then cuts this string, and eventually this causes the napkin to wipe this person's face. Now, when you look at the intracellular signaling machinery, it looks sometimes almost this contrived. There are so many steps, each of the steps quite necessary things. And yet the difference with the Rube Goldberg contraption is that they are far more robust. Oftentimes, even when something fails, there are other fail-safe mechanisms which step in to take care of the end result. And it's important that they be so, because if you don't have that, you get diseases. So for example, cancer, which is very confusing to many biologists, because there's not a single disease which is cancer. There are essentially 200 different diseases which all go under the name of cancer. But what is common across all these diseases is that it's a systems disease. It involves the disruption not of a single gene oftentimes, but the disruption of a whole set of interactions. So how do you understand this except by appealing to the network? And so what we do is by taking a network-centric view to it, and as Yuri Lazarnik famously said, that trying to solve biological problems using the perspective of networks is to some extent asking the question of, can a biologist fix a radio? So for example, if you look at a radio and you take, for example, a defective radio which is not operating, and you try to take a biologist approach to it, what will you do? So you would essentially take, first of all, you'd write a grant application and buy maybe hundreds of other radios. And then what you would do is you would set different graduate students at work to pull out various components, right? So each of the graduate students has a task of pulling out one particular component and then trying to turn on the radio to see if it works or not. Okay? So for example, then one enterprising graduate student suddenly realizes that there's this connecting wire which connects the body of the radio to this extended object, which if you cut, the radio doesn't make noise anymore. And so this person gets very excited and calls it the important component, the most important component, MIC. Okay? And then some other enterprising graduate student in some other lab suddenly figures out that, wait a minute, it's not the link, it's this extended object. So if you take out the extended object, nothing seems to work anymore. And the longer it is, the better it is. So he calls it the even more important component, the EMIC. Okay? And so on and so forth. Okay? And so essentially the biologist starts out from a single component and tries to build up some kind of a flow, whereas we all know that the circuit diagram actually looks something like this. Okay? So in the case of the biological cell, we have essentially this particular problem of, first of all, how to construct such a circuit diagram, and then trying to understand how is it that the different parts kind of work together. Now, there are two possible approaches you can use. So one approach is you break it down to the simplest possible elements, each of which individually you can understand, and then hopefully you can put them together so that it makes sense. So for example, if you want to understand cell cycle regulation, you can kind of understand it as, made out of a negative feedback oscillator and two toggle switches, each of which you can understand separately. But most of the time, this doesn't work, because in order to make each of the parts comprehensible, they have to be very, very small. The other approach, the so-called modular approach, is where you coarse-grain the system so that you don't have to deal with the individual entities, but rather with groups of components, each of which perform a specific function. And this is very similar to, for example, thinking of a computer as made out of several blocks, each of which performs certain specific functional tasks. And so what we do in our group is essentially take such a modular approach to solve complex networks, where we take what is known as a mesoscopic approach. So instead of viewing the network in all its glory, or just focusing on individual component parts, we essentially break it down into blocks. Essentially, for example, they could be modules which are extremely densely connected with each other, but then very sparsely connected with each other. Or they could have some kind of a hierarchical organization where you can organize them into layers, or they could have a core periphery organization where essentially you have a very densely connected core of components which are kind of sparsely connected to all the other parts of the network, and try to understand how the whole functions. All right, so you can see such modular networks at work across nature, and you can even find them in social networks. And what we try to understand is what does modularity impart in such networks. So for example, some of the members of my group try to understand how is it that epidemics propagate in social networks. And so what we do is, for example, we take empirical social networks. So this is for a Karnataka village where the nodes are individual people and the links are the actual social relations they have with each other. And you see that they are colored with different colors. So the blue are the susceptible individuals, the red are the people who are infected, and the greens are the ones who are recovered. So initially, most people are susceptible, a few are infected. And as the simulation proceeds, we can see how gradually people get infected, some of them recover. But then over time, as people recover and then eventually again become susceptible, again the whole infection recurs and so on. So one of the things we have found out is that modularity, or this organization of social networks into communities, makes them susceptible to have extremely long-lasting epidemic recurrences. So if you see, for example, how frequently an epidemic recurs in a modular social network versus a network which doesn't have such modular structures, you find that a disease with even extremely low infectiousness can actually last for extremely long times in networks with such community organization as opposed to unstructured networks. All right, so let me stop at this point. We can always take questions at either end of this or maybe at the end of this whole meeting, and I'd be happy to answer any questions that you may have about how such approaches to understand complex systems, in particular taking the mesoscopic approach, can actually help in understanding complex systems spanning from biology to society to economics, essentially to anything that you can think of. Okay, thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much, Dr. Sinha, for such a wonderful talk. It was wonderful to see that you began with an epistemological inquiry in complex systems, and then kind of weaving across these insights that I think most of the audience will definitely find interesting and valuable for their own pursuits. So now I request Dr. Vidyadhar Murkavi, who was the speaker for the first symposium that we organized last year. He is the director at the CSIR's Fourth Paradigm Institute in Bangalore, and Thank you, Dr. Sinha. Thank you, Dr. Murkavi.